Imagine a sound, not the roar of cannons, nor the clash of steel. Another sound, a hiss, as if a piece of raw meat had been thrown onto a red-hot pan. And then, a scream, a blood-curdling scream. This is the sound of healing. The year is 1537, a battlefield after the siege of Turin. And you are a young surgeon, not yet 30. Your work is simple and horrifying. Before you lies a soldier. An arquebus shot has torn a hole in his leg. Gunpowder, as the old masters taught you, is poison, and the only way to expel poison from a wound is to burn it out. You take a ladle, scoop elderberry oil from a boiling cauldron, and pour it directly into the open, bleeding flesh. The meat shrivels. The man loses consciousness from the pain, and that perhaps is the best thing that can happen to him. You do it again, and again, and again, with one, then another, then a tenth. The smell of burning human flesh mingles with the scent of fear. This is not medicine. It is torture that sometimes, by sheer chance, saves a man from gangrene. And then, amidst this hell, stands a young man. His name is Ambroise Paré. He is only 26, and he is no learned doctor from a Parisian university. He is a barber surgeon, a practical man, a fellow who learned his trade by bloodletting and pulling teeth in a city barber shop. This is his first war. The first time he has seen steel and lead tear human bodies apart on an industrial scale. He does what he was taught. He pours boiling oil into wounds because that's what the books say. That's what all the great surgeons before him did. The sun sets. The wounded are endless. Dozens of groaning bodies lie on straw, awaiting their turn for the life-saving cauterization. Ambroise, exhausted, his hands bloody up to the elbows, reaches for the cauldron again, and the ladle scrapes the bottom. The oil is gone. All of it. There's nothing left. What to do? Leave them to die? Say there wasn't enough medicine? Other, more experienced surgeons would simply shrug. War is war. But this stubborn barber boy looks into the eyes of the next soldier and cannot turn away. In a panic, he begins to improvise. He grabs whatever is at hand in his campaign chest. Egg yolk, a little rose oil, and turpentine. He mixes it all into a simple, cool salve. It doesn't hiss. It doesn't burn. It just soothes. Shamefully, almost apologetically, he applies this simple poultice to the dreadful wounds of those for whom there was no boiling oil. He is certain he has made a terrible mistake. He has violated protocol. He has condemned these men to a torturous death from infection. He doesn't sleep all night. He tosses and turns, hears groans, and awaits the morning with primal dread. He awaits dawn like a death sentence, to see the corpses of those he so ineptly treated. Dawn in a 16th-century military hospital was a time for counting losses. Not those left on the field with a crossbow bolt in their throat, but those who died overnight, already saved. And this was commonplace. Surgery of that era was not about healing. It was about survival at any cost, and that cost was exorbitant. Let's be clear. A surgeon back then was closer to a butcher or a carpenter than to a physician as we understand the term. His main tools were a saw, a knife, and a red-hot iron. His main principle was to cut and burn. Amputating a shattered leg while 3 stout orderlies held down a screaming patient was considered the pinnacle of skill. It was quick, straightforward, and offered at least some chance. But gunshot wounds, oh, that was a completely different story. All the luminaries of medicine, all the authorities whose books were hand-copied, agreed on one thing: gunpowder is poison. It poisons the flesh, penetrates the blood, and kills a man from within. And how do you fight poison? Correct, you burn it out. Destroy it with fire. The logic was as simple as an axe blow. Pure fire against dirty poison. Therefore, into every bullet hole, into every ragged arquebus wound, boiling oil was to be poured. Not warm, but boiling, bubbling, so that it would penetrate the deepest pockets of the wound and kill the venom. No one considered that this caused monstrous burns, killed healthy tissue, and created an ideal gateway for infection. On the contrary, a cauterized wound was considered a cleansed wound. That 9 out of 10 soldiers cleansed in this manner died in terrible agony from fever and gangrene was attributed to anything: bad air, weakness of the body, too potent a poison, but never to the treatment itself. After all, their fathers and grandfathers did it this way. It was written in sacred treatises. To doubt this was like doubting that the sun revolved around the earth. It was not merely medical practice. It was dogma. And now, morning breaks. Ambroise has barely slept, starting at every groan. He rises, walks through the makeshift infirmary with a heavy heart. He goes to face his disgrace. He is a killer by negligence. First, he approaches those who were lucky, those he managed to treat according to all the rules, with boiling elderberry oil. These soldiers are not sleeping. They stare at the ceiling with clouded eyes, their foreheads burning with fever. Their wounds are swollen, the edges blackened, pus oozing from under the bandages. They moan at the slightest movement. All as usual, the normal course of the illness. Ambroise nods. This is how it should be. And then, steeling himself, he turns to the other group, to his guinea pigs, to those for whom there was no oil, to those he smeared yesterday with that shameful mixture of egg yolk and turpentine. He expects to see cold, stiff bodies, or even worse, people writhing in the agony of gangrene. He approaches the first one and freezes. The soldier is asleep, peacefully. He doesn't even groan. Ambroise, disbelieving his eyes, carefully lifts the bandage. Beneath it, there is no terrible swelling, no blackness. The wound looks clean. It's just a wound, not a burnt piece of flesh. He goes to the second, to the third. The picture is the same. They spent the night calmly, without fever or hellish pain. They rested. They are alive and noticeably better than those treated scientifically. At that moment, something breaks in the young barber surgeon's mind. He feels no triumph. He doesn't shout, "Eureka!" He feels a deafening, icy shock. Everything he was taught, all the books he read, all the authorities he revered, they all lied. Or even more terrifying, they simply didn't know, didn't want to know. He, a 26-year-old boy, a barbershop practitioner, had just learned from his own bitter experience that torture does not heal, but simple compassion, mixed with egg yolk, does. From that very morning, for Ambroise Paré, the old world crumbled, and he vowed no more boiling oil would touch human flesh where he stood with a knife, even if it meant being burned at the stake alongside witches. But a vow is one thing, and having the captain of the Royal Musketeers on your table, his leg ravaged by a cannonball, is quite another. Around you stand gray-bearded masters, surgeons of renown. They look at you as if you're an annoying fly. To them, you're still just an upstart barber. They nod to their assistants. "Bring the cauldron. Don't spare the oil. The captain is an important man." And there it is, the nauseatingly familiar smell of boiling elderberry oil. Ambroise shakes his head, quietly but firmly. "No need." The senior surgeon, Master Gustave, his hands scarred from past operations, snorts contemptuously. "The boy wants to play doctor? Do you want the captain to die of poison by morning?" Paré doesn't answer. He silently takes out his vials. Egg yolk, rose oil, turpentine. He begins to mix his simple salve right before their eyes. Silence hangs in the tent, broken only by the captain's groans. The masters watch his actions with disgusted curiosity, as if observing a village charlatan's tricks. He doesn't pour. He doesn't burn. He takes a clean linen cloth, soaks it in his cool mixture, and carefully, almost tenderly, begins to clean the edges of the wound. Then he applies a dressing. No hissing, no ear-splitting screams. The captain, who had braced himself for hellish pain, opens his eyes and looks at Paré in surprise. He feels only a coolness and a slight tingle from the turpentine. "And that is all," he whispers. "For today, that is all," Ambroise replies. "Now you need rest." Master Gustave can't hold back. He laughs out loud. "Rest! He gave him rest. Eternal rest. By morning the leg will be black, and we'll have to saw it off at the hip, if the poor fellow even survives." The other surgeons nod in agreement. They step aside so as not to be tainted by this disgrace. They have already mentally buried both the captain and the reputation of this arrogant youth. Ambroise remains sitting by the wounded man's cot. All night. He doesn't pray. He observes. And the rumor of the barber who chose to heal without fire or pain spread through the camp faster than soldiers' lice. And in the morning people flocked to that tent. Not just surgeons. Ordinary soldiers, officers, even sutlers. Everyone wanted to gaze at this miracle, or this disgrace. In the center of attention was the captain. He had not died. He was not delirious with fever. He sat on his cot, drinking broth, and even tried to joke. His leg, of course, hurt, but it was the pain of a wound, not of torture. It was not swollen, not blackened. It was simply healing. And here lies Ambroise Paré's main secret, his superpower. It wasn't in vials or recipes. He had no secret formula passed down from an alchemist grandfather. His genius was that he could do what all those learned masters had forgotten how to do. He could look, simply look, with his own eyes. Do you understand the point? All the other surgeons weren't looking at the wound. They were looking at a book, an old, worn treatise, written 1,000 years ago by some Galen or Avicenna. The book said, "Gunpowder is poison," and they saw poison in the wound. The book said, "Poison is expelled by fire," and they saw the need for fire. They weren't treating a soldier. They were treating a quote from a book. Their minds were so filled with other people's thoughts and dogmas that there was no room left for simple observation. Ambroise was different. He was a practitioner to the core. He didn't read clever books in Latin. He looked at people. And that morning, after a sleepless night, he did something no one had done before him. He conducted the first, albeit unconscious, controlled study in the history of medicine. He had a control group, those treated with boiling oil, and he had an experimental group, those who received his salve, and he simply compared the results. Some writhed in pain and fever, others slept peacefully. The conclusion? The conclusion was obvious to anyone with eyes and a shred of common sense. The masters, of course, hissed. "It's a coincidence. The captain just has a strong constitution. The real poison will show up in 3 days." They couldn't admit that some barber boy, mixing yolk and turpentine, was smarter than all the ancient authorities. To admit that would mean admitting that they had been maiming, not healing, their entire lives. That their hands, of which they were so proud, had brought more suffering than enemy bullets. Almost no one is capable of such an admission. His real discovery was not in the egg yolk. It was in the simplest, most human action, to look, compare, and draw a conclusion. Not to pore over an ancient tome, but to look at a living, suffering person. And this simple ability to see the truth right before his nose turned out to be more terrifying than any boiling oil, and wiser than all the Latin treatises combined. News of the fireless treatment spread through the army, and then throughout France, faster than a soldier's louse. And you think everyone rushed to shake Ambroise's hand and carry him on their shoulders? Far from it. When rumors reached Paris, the warm offices of the medical faculty, and the College of Surgeons of St. Cosmas, such an outcry arose that the stained glass windows in the cathedrals trembled. At first they simply laughed. Some barber, a boor who could barely write in French, let alone noble Latin, had invented something better than the methods of the great Galen? It was an anecdote, a joke for drunken soldiers. But then reports began to arrive. One nobleman saved, another captain survived, a third, a fourth, a 10th, and the laughter in the offices turned into an angry hiss. And this is where it gets interesting. It wasn't fools who rose up against Ambroise Paré. The entire system stood against him. Professors whose gray beards inspired awe in students, medical officials who issued licenses and permits. This whole army of men in robes and with academic degrees saw a mortal threat in a simple barber, a threat not to patients' health, a threat to their authority, their income, their entire comfortable world built on quotes from ancient books. They began writing denunciations against him. They wrote to the king, to generals, to each other. This Paré is a charlatan. His method is a devilish trick. He just kills soldiers slower than others. Their main argument was devastatingly simple and monstrously absurd. He had no right to treat because he hadn't studied at university. He couldn't explain in Latin how his poultice worked, and if he couldn't explain it according to the rules, then it wasn't science, but sorcery. It was a war, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet of offices. They demanded he be forbidden to practice, forbidden even to approach the wounded. They tried to take away his only weapons, his hands and his eyes. For them, it was better for hundreds of soldiers to die according to all the rules of science, in agony from boiling oil, than for one soldier to be saved by an uneducated barber in violation of all canons. For if this upstart barber was right, then all their science was a lie, all their diplomas just paper. and all their patients who died in agony from boiling oil on their conscience. But war doesn't read denunciations, and bullets don't ask for a Latin diploma. The year 1545, the siege of Boulogne, and a spear fragment flies directly into the face of the first nobleman of France, Duke François de Guise. It enters beneath his right eye and exits from the other side, between his neck and the back of his head, breaking off the tip inside. The Duke falls. Unconscious, he is brought into the king's tent. All the cream of Parisian medicine gathers around him. They look at the wound, shake their heads, and throw up their hands. The verdict is unanimous. No hope. If they try to pull out the tip, it will sever all vessels. The Duke will die of bleeding in a minute. If they leave it, he will die of infection in a couple of days. That's it. The end. The great commander is doomed. The king is in despair. And then someone from the retinue whispers, "Your Majesty, there is a barber, Paré. They say he performs miracles." And so, into the royal tent, smelling of expensive incense and fear, enters Ambroise. Without a robe, without a gray beard, a simple man in a leather apron. He silently examines the wound. The professors look down on him. They expect him to also throw up his hands and confirm their diagnosis. But Paré asks for blacksmith's tongs. A bewildered silence hangs in the tent. He didn't read prayers. He didn't muse about poisons. He approached the task like a mechanic. He told his assistant to hold the Duke's head. Then he braced his boot against the Duke's face for leverage, gripped the protruding splinter of the shaft with the tongs, and pulled with all his might. With a crunch that made the courtier's knees buckle, he extracted the tip along with pieces of bone. Blood gushed forth, but Ambroise was ready. He no longer burned. He tamponaded, irrigated, applied his soothing dressings. He worked quickly, precisely, and silently. And Duc de Guise did not die. Not that night, nor the next day. He survived. And a few weeks later, he was back in the saddle, albeit with an ugly scar for life, which earned him the nickname Le Balafré, the Scarred. This scar was living proof that could not be disputed in a treatise or burned in a denunciation. The King of France, Henry II, saw it all with his own eyes. He called the simple barber to him and spoke words that changed everything. "Henceforth, you are my surgeon, and I want you to serve me as faithfully as I will protect you." At that moment, the war of the Parisian doctors against Ambroise Paré was lost. He received the most reliable safe conduct in the world, royal patronage, and this safe conduct became his main instrument. He served not one king, but 4. He went through 10 wars, and every time cannons roared, he was there, in the thick of it, with his small chest, which no longer contained a cauldron for oil. But gunshot wounds were only the beginning. There was another thing, far more terrifying: amputation. Imagine the horror. The saw has gone through the bone. Blood gushes like a fountain. What next? Next is the most terrifying part. An assistant takes a red-hot iron rod from a brazier, and with this rod, he cauterizes the bleeding stump. A hiss, the smell of burnt flesh and hair, a scream that no longer sounds human. This was called stopping the blood, and it killed more often than the saw itself. The person either died of shock on the table, or later, from infection, which gladly took up residence in that huge, charred wound. And here is another soldier, another shattered leg. Everyone waits for Ambroise to command the brazier to be brought, but he doesn't command it. He does something that seemed even crazier than his salve. Instead of a red-hot rod, he took out a needle and thread, ordinary silk thread, and before the astonished colleagues, with this needle, he carefully, like a tailor, began to catch the bleeding vessels and arteries and simply tie them off. One knot, a second, a third. The bleeding stopped. Without a hiss, without the smell of burning, without hellish pain. Today this seems obvious to us. But then, it was sorcery. He was again accused of all sins. These threads will rot inside the body. You are trapping evil humors, not letting them escape with the blood. But Paré again simply looked and saw. Patients whose vessels he ligated survived much more often. Their wounds healed cleaner and faster, because he didn't create a massive burn at the site of the cut, an ideal gateway for infection. He transformed amputation from an act of desperation, from a butcher's job, into what we today call surgery. He gave thousands of people not just life, but life without torture. And so he was, the first surgeon to 4 kings, savior of dukes, and thousands of nameless soldiers. His hands worked miracles. But in Paris, in the quiet of the offices, he was still considered an upstart, a butcher who just got lucky. They couldn't forgive him for being right. And then Ambroise did something that infuriated them more than all his salves and threads combined. He sat down and wrote a book. You see, in those days, only a doctor, a professor, could write about medicine. And he had to write in Latin, the sacred language of science, inaccessible to commoners. It was their exclusive club. But Paré, this barber, writes in simple, common French. He writes so that any village healer, any soldier who learned to read, could understand him. He doesn't quote Galen. He writes, I went here, I saw this, I did that, and the patient lived. He describes his instruments, his dressings, his mistakes. It wasn't a treatise. It was an honest diary of a practitioner. When the book was published, the University of Paris went into hysterics. The Faculty of Medicine sued him. They demanded that Parliament ban this shameful book. Their main argument? This man is ignorant. He doesn't know Latin. He disgraces the high art of healing with his boorish advice. They shouted that he was revealing the secrets of the profession to the rabble, and now every shoemaker would imagine himself a surgeon and start cutting people. But it was too late. The book was already circulating, and other surgeons, practitioners like him, read it and tried it. And it worked for them, because Ambroise Paré wasn't selling them a magic potion. He wasn't creating a new dogma to replace the old one. His entire book, his entire life, came down to one simple, incredibly audacious idea. The idea he encapsulated in his famous motto, I dressed him, and God healed him. He stripped the surgeon of the crown of the omnipotent sage and returned him to his true craft. This was his main lesson. He didn't teach others to blindly copy his recipes. He taught them to do what he himself had done that terrible night near Turin. He taught them to look, simply to look, and to see.